so we're going to start thinking about consumer theory. And there are a lot of approaches and places to start consumer theory. Many approaches to consumer theory start with sort of an axiomatic view of preferences and things like that. Yeah, and you can find that, and certainly on the reading list there'll be places you can go to find that. Just about any graduate textbook will give you what you need to know. I'm actually going to take a much more practical approach. I'm going to do what most economists, most applied versions of economics are going to start with. I'm going to assume that we start with a utility function. And we're going to have a utility function that's defined over a set of goods, x1 up to xn. So x1 up to xn represent the quantity the individual is consuming of each of n goods. And for now, and I'll come back later and relax this a little bit, I'll assume that each of these goods is being purchased in a market, okay? Later, we might want to think about cases where there are goods that aren't purchased in a market. There are goods that are produced at home, there are goods that are purchased in some other way, or goods that maybe you just have, or you were endowed with, you found, didn't purchase them anyway. So we can bring that in, but for now, we'll assume all these goods are purchased in the market. Now we're going to assume that you're buying them at prices P1 Pn are the prices of each of those goods. And we'll assume that you have, so this is utility. These are the prices. And we'll have your income. And I'm just going to assume your income is M. That's your income. And for now, I'll just assume all the prices and income are in dollars. Measured in dollars. And there's another element to the units here. And again, when you're thinking about consumption, you got to think about the units. So the units have to align between these things. So for example, when we talk about income, you got to talk about income per unit time, right? So income is your weekly income, it's your monthly income, it's your annual income. Now it may not matter too much which of those you use, but it determines the units in which X are measured, right? So if M is income per week, then X is going to be consumption per week. Everybody understand that? M is income per year, X is going to be consumption per year. Anybody who come from the physical sciences, remember you always check that your units made sense across the two sides of your equations, right? This is the same thing true in economics. The units have to make sense. You'd be amazed at how many people, when they go to do empirical work, forget that they have to use the same units on both sides, right? You got to measure things in the same units. All right, so anyway, now we usually think about this consumer as having a budget constraint, and the budget constraint is the sum from I equals 1 to n of the xi pi less than or equal to your income. That is, you can't spend any more than your income. Now that doesn't mean you can't borrow and lend. If you're interested in consumption in multiple periods of time, it just means you have to think about this income as encompassing the income over some longer period of time, and borrowing and lending in future consumption would be one of these goods that you're buying. You have to think about what the prices are. But the basic idea is that you're limited in terms of your choices by you're some kind of budget constraint. Now, in a market economy, we usually think about income as a budget constraint. For Robinson Crusoe on island, you might start with something more fundamental, like he's got a certain amount of time he has available, and that's his constraint. Okay, and you can go back and forth between one and the other, but for now, let's think about the market economy case. Now, the most typical way to solve this problem is to set up what's known as a Lagrangian, which I think most of you should know. Lagrangian is just a way of solving a constrained maximization problem, and our consumer is going to be interested in let's maximize. So we're going to max u of x1 up to xn subject to the sum of xi equals 1 to n, xi pi less than or equal to m. That implies my Lagrangian can be written as u of x1 up to xn plus this magic multiplier lambda, which represents the budget constraint, the power of the budget constraint, times m minus the sum of I equals 1 to n xi pi. That's the method of Lagrange multipliers, which can be used to solve this kind of maximization problem. And for purposes of economics, it's going to have a nice approach because that lambda term is going to turn out to be quite interpretable in terms of the underlying economics. So the first order conditions, you solve this problem by taking the derivatives of this Lagrangian with respect to each of the x's and with respect to lambda. You're not really maximizing the Lagrangian. For those of you coming from mathematics, this is really what's called a saddle point, but same idea. Critical point is still the same. Your first order conditions are partial u partial x1 minus lambda p1 equals 0 down to partial u partial xn minus lambda pn equals 0, and your budget constraint, sum of the xi pi less than or equal to m. Or sorry, I'm just going to say equals. I'm going to do the typical case, and I'm going to assume that you exhaust all your income. And in a general problem like this, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, this guy's not going to want to leave stuff on the table. He's not going to want to have income left over. He's going to spend it all. And he's going to end up using all that income, consuming the various goods. We can then rewrite these first order conditions as partial u partial x1 equals lambda p1 down to partial u partial xn equals lambda pn, and the sum of the xi pi equals m. So those are our first order conditions. And what do those first order conditions tell us as a matter of economics? Well, let's think about, take the ratio of any two of these first order conditions. Partial u partial xi divided by partial u partial xj equals pi over pj. So any pair of those equations, I could take the ratio of those equations to give me that formula there. What does that tell me? How do you interpret that equation? What does economics do? Yeah?
Marginal utility of substitution.
Well, but try to say it more in English. Try to explain to your mom. Your mom, what the hell are you talking about? Okay, well, let's talk about the two sides of the equation, because I actually think of the two sides of the equation quite distinctly. So, for example, what is this? It is the ratio of prices, but a step further. What ratio? What does that ratio tell me? What you give up? What would you have to give up? How much would that you have to give up of which good to get which one? Which one? Which way? It's how many units of good J you have to give up to get a unit of good I. Otherwise known in economics as the cost of good I, expressed in terms of units of good J. Right? So this is the cost of good I. And because I divided by Pj, it's expressed in terms of units of good J. It says it takes you got to give up 3 units of good J to get a unit of good I. That's what it says. Right? It says it costs me 3 units of J to get a unit of good I. This is what we call, in economics, I think about this as the cost. This is the cost of consuming good I. The more I want, the less J I get. Or I could have divided by K, less of all the other goods. If I want to consume more I, my budget constraint says I got to consume less of something else. One of the things I can consume less of is J. Okay. What is this? What is that ratio measure? Yeah, that's a good term. I usually use the term value. It's how much I value good I in terms of good J. It's the amount I'm willing to give up of good J to get a unit of good I. Right? Why does that measure the amount of good J I'd be willing to give up to get a unit of good I? Because it's what holds, it keeps my utility constant, right? That is, if you give me this many units of good J per unit of good I, that holds my utility constant, right? I mean, think about it. If, like, say the margin utility of a good I is 3 and the margin utility of good J is 1, then if I gave you 3 units of good J for every unit of good I you gave up, you'd be just as well off, because you'd be losing just as much from getting less I as you'd be gaining from getting more J. Right? So people call this the marginal rate of substitution, but really in economic terms, it's really the value of good I in terms of J. Okay? Value of good I. And so this first order condition says, in order to be at an optimum point, you have to be at a point where what it costs you to consume more I equals how much you value consuming more I. What would be true if this wasn't the case? What if this didn't hold? What if this side was bigger than that side? Could you be at an optimum? You would take less J and more I, you'd be better off. The market says I only have to give up 3 units of good J to get a unit of good I. I'm willing to give up 5 units of good J to get a unit of good I. I can make myself better off, right? This is what we always get in economics. This is the marginal benefit. This is the marginal cost. And if you really understood that, you're like 90%, I don't know, 80% of the way through economics, right? That's 80% economics right there, right? It's just finding that in every problem is really the key. How do I find that key element? How do I identify the marginal benefit? How do I identify the marginal cost? And how in the world do I figure out where those two things are equal? Okay. So that kind of is a very simple way to think of it. Any questions that people have? Now there's a bunch of other ways I could think about this. I could think about it as partial u partial xi divided by pi equals partial u partial xj divided by pj. Okay? And of course, in my notation, that's all equal to lambda. Because both of those got to be equal to lambda. What does that say? What does this equation say? What is this? Yeah. Yeah, it's the utility I gain per dollar from consuming good I. At whatever point I'm at my current point, remember, the way we're finding an optimum is we're finding a point where all these equations hold. So the only way we can, remember, these are necessary conditions for being at the optimum. So in order to be at an optimum, it's got to be the case that the utility on the margin per dollar has to be the same for all the goods. But that makes sense. What if the utility per dollar were greater on good I than it was on good J? Then what should you do? You should move dollars from J to I until they're equal. Right? Then you can't be at an equilibrium if those two things are not equal. Okay. Now, if you were at a corner and you weren't consuming any of good J and you were consuming good I, maybe you can't move any further in that direction. So that could happen, but it will only happen if you're at a corner. If I'm consuming some of both, I got to have these things be equal. Right? Everybody understand that? Anything else? People understand where that works? But it also says I now have an interpretation of lambda. What is lambda? What is lambda? What is this multiplier going to turn out to be? If I solve this Lagrangian and I get the equilibrium value of lambda. It's how much utility I get from an extra dollar. Spent how? Yeah, spent. It doesn't matter how I spend it. You gave me an extra dollar and I spent it on I spent it on J, I spent it half on I, half on J. Doesn't matter. When these equations hold, the margin utility of a dollar spent is going to be the same spent however you want. That's going to turn out to be quite important for us. Because it means, well, if we want to try to value how much something's worth, we don't have to really worry that much about how the guy actually is going to spend it. We can talk about the value of something independent of what he's actually going to do. Turns out that matters a lot. So for example, if you're interested in like the medical area, and you want to know, well, what's the value of putting fluoride into the water? And dentists will say, well, we should put fluoride in the water because it'll reduce cavities. But maybe in equilibrium, it won't reduce cavities. Because when we put the fluoride in the water, people stop brushing their teeth. And they actually get up with just as many or more cavities than they did before. And the dentists come back and say, holy shit, we put the fluoride in the water, it didn't do any good. We didn't benefit. An economist comes back and says, yes, we did. People benefited. They didn't have to brush their teeth anymore. They might not benefited how you wanted them to benefit, which is to get healthier teeth. Didn't mean they didn't benefit. They benefited in some other way. And it really doesn't matter how they chose to take their benefits. They would benefit from that either way. They could have gotten cleaner teeth. That clearly would have benefited them. The fact that they chose not cleaner teeth in some other way means, if anything, to a second order, they're actually even better off. Because they took something they valued even more than cleaner teeth. People understand how that works? That's a key idea. You don't really have to know. You don't have to look at it that way. It's very frustrating often for policymakers who have an intended result, even though people end up fighting against that result. Right? That happens all the time. Come up with a drug that helps people deal with being overweight. Well, people get fatter. I mean, it's just the way the world works. Right? So it's an equilibrium. But for this purpose, it works okay. All right. So that's kind of our equation. Now, another thing that you could think about, and this makes sense, is just look at the equations that we started with. Partial u partial x1 equals lambda p1 down to partial u partial xn equals lambda pn. I got my n equations. And remember, lambda is the same in every equation. So it tells me that in equilibrium, marginal utilities are proportional to prices. And lambda is that factor of proportionality. So if we can measure the prices that people face, we can indirectly measure their marginal utilities, because we know their marginal utilities have to be proportional to their prices. And as economists, we use that all the time. That prices are very revealing about people's values precisely because people are optimizing. Right? It tells us that when one good costs 5 times what another good is, that to the individuals consuming that good, let's say price of good 10 equals 5 times the price of good 6. Well, that tells us that a unit of good 10, it's got to be worth 5 times as much as good 6. People say, well, that's market value. That's not real value. And your answer is what? What should your answer be? Is this just the market value, or is this... What would be true about a bunch of consumers, 300 million consumers buying these two products in this market? Okay. So what if everybody's buying the good and they can buy as much as they want, and they're buying to the point, just like we have here, nice smooth indifference curves and all that, then everybody's value would be 5 times. Everybody would say this good's 5 times as good as that good on the margin. I value this good 5 times as much as I value that good for all the people that are buying. And that ratio of market values is going to be not just applied to some arbitrary person, it applies to a lot of people. Okay, it applies to everybody in my simple example where everybody can buy all they want. Any questions that people have? We'll come back and deal with corners in a minute, which is really what you're talking about. All right. So is there any powerful implications of that? I'll give you one. Let's say, for example, I observe somebody 2 alternative states of the world. In state 1, he consumes x1 up to xn. Let's put a star here. These are his equilibrium consumptions. Price is P1 up to Pn, and income M. And now let's assume that we perturb the market in some way. We change prices, we change income, maybe we change income and prices simultaneously. So we have some dm is a change in income, dp1 up to dpn is a change in prices, and I see dx1 up to dxn are the changes in consumptions. And I want to know, has this perturbation to prices and income made this person better off or worse off? How would I measure that? In other words, what can I say about du? What can I say about the change in utility? Is this person now better off or worse off than he was before we changed his prices and income? Well, let's think about it. What is du? What is du? Well, it's du of x1 up to xn. Everybody agrees with that, right? So isn't du equals the sum from I equals 1 to n of partial u partial xi dxi? Everybody agrees with that? It's du, right? Why is utility different than it was a minute ago? It changed because I changed all my consumptions. But what's partial u partial xi? What is it? That's lambda pi. So du equals sum from I equals 1 to n of lambda pi dxi equals the sum from I equals 1 to n with a lambda on the outside, because the lambda doesn't depend on I, of pi dxi. And the key notion is that the sum of pi dxi is an observable quantity. It's an observable quantity. It's something I can measure. I know the prices. I know the changes in consumption. I can ask, is he better or worse off just by looking at this equation? This equation is going to tell me, but it's not only going to tell me whether he's better or worse off, it's going to say du over lambda equals the sum from I equals 1 to n pi dxi. Well, what is du over lambda? Well, du is a change in utility. Change in utility. And what is lambda? It's a change in utility per dollar of income. So this is the dollar value of how much better off he is. That is, I can measure whether he's better or worse off, but not only can I measure he's better or worse off, I can measure by how much. He's better off to the tune of $100, or he's better off or worse off to the tune of $10, whatever way it goes. What am I using here? How am I measuring whether he's better or worse off? Simply by looking at that formula. What's at the core of this? Right? We're using the fact that because they're optimizing, the margin of utility of the various goods are proportional to their prices. And therefore, when you say, well, I got more of X, less of Y, how do I trade them off? Well, the answer is I know how to trade them off. The prices tell me exactly how to trade them off. So I know each extra unit of X was worth 3 and each less unit of Y was worth 2. I can trade them off one against the other. I can observe his relative values of the different goods because I can observe the prices in the market. People see that? Yes? No. Where did I use lambda was constant? I didn't use anything about lambda constant. These are, if they're not, well, let's think about it. Let's assume these are not small changes. Let's think about what happens when, let's think about what's going on here, because this is actually going to be helpful. So, think about the two good case. Okay? Here's x1, here's x2. This is n equals 2. In the n equals 2 world, I can draw a graph, right? My budget constraint in n equals 2 world looks like that, right? That's my budget constraint in n equals 2. This is m over p1. This is m over p2. My equilibrium looks like that. This is my equilibrium indifference curve that I'm on, right? This is my indifference curve. This is u of x1, x2 equals some u star, which is the maximum utility I can obtain. And there's my equilibrium right there. Right? If I look at that equation over there on the board, that left-hand side is the slope of the indifference curve in absolute value at each point. The right-hand side is the slope of the budget line, and my equilibrium says I got to be tangent. That's really what that equation is. Okay. This equation here. This is the absolute value of the indifference curve slope. This is the absolute value of the budget line slope. And the equilibrium point is where those two things are equal. And I can think about, like, you know, what's wrong with that point? Well, what's wrong with that point is what? Why is that not a good point? How would you explain what's wrong with this point here?
You could spend the same amount and get it more utility.
Okay. Right, that's one way. But that's kind of like saying it's not maximizing, right? That's what it means not to be maximized. It's like, it's not the best point because I can get something better. That's what you told me. Okay, but what about in terms of thinking about it that way, in terms of that equation? The slope of this indifference curve measures how much of this good I'm willing to give up to get more of good one. At this point, what's wrong with this point? Right, my value of x1, which is the slope of this indifference curve, exceeds my cost of good one, which is the slope of this budget line. Therefore, I should get more one, right? I should move to the right. My equilibrium is here. So in equilibrium, I have to be tangent. That's what these first order conditions are telling you. And this equation is exploiting that tangency. It says, look, I don't know this guy's indifference curves. I don't know, I can't measure his indifference curves, but I can measure his budget line, and I know his indifference curve has to be tangent to his budget line. Okay. Now let's get to your question. But I not only know his indifference curve is tangent to the budget line, I know his indifference curve kind of is above that budget line, right? It can't be below it. It's got to be tangent the way I've drawn it. It has to be tangent from above. So this equation here implicitly is approximating his indifference curve by the budget line. It's using this budget line to approximate the indifference curve, which means it's going to be biased in a particular direction. It means if you're moving, if that term is 0, so you're moving along the budget line, you're actually getting somewhat worse off. Right? This is going to have, like, the second order term here is going to be biasing it toward, if you're moving along the budget line, which means that term is 0, first order you're indifferent. You're getting no change in utility. Second order you're worse off. Okay? And when we talk about price indices, we'll come back and talk about that. It's one of the reasons why price indices are going to have some issues, because they're not going to, second order, they're not going to, in fact, it's a good feature. In second order, they're going to be off in one direction or the other. Okay. Does that help answer your question? Okay. All right. Any questions that people have? Any questions before we move on? So one of the things I like to emphasize is that there's a lot of content to just utility maximization. Just utility theory alone, probably the most important message is this proportionality and equilibrium between prices and margin utilities. And the reason that turns out to be so important is we can measure prices directly. Whereas when it comes to measuring utilities, not so easy. Not something. You don't have a utility meter on your head. I can't look at your head and figure out what your utility is. I have to infer something about the preferences from your observed behavior. And the process and the idea that you're maximizing is going to give me a powerful way for looking into your preferences. I'll come back in a minute and talk about preferences because, again, one of the major problems we're going to have as economists is we really don't have a really good theory of preferences. We really don't. We have sort of an empirical theory of preferences. People like what they like. How do I know they like it? Because they choose it. That really is our theory. Our theory of preferences is people like what they choose. That's what maximization is all about. It'd be much better if we had a theory that could tell you what people like without having seen their choices to begin with. You'd be a really good marketer if you could figure that out. You could figure out what products people were going to like before you produce them. But, we spent a lot of resources producing products that ultimately people didn't like nearly as much as we thought they would. But that's okay. Any questions that people have before I move forward? All right, so where do we go from here? We already have expressed kind of the fundamental idea of maximization. Now, you can do almost all of economics always starting here at the beginning in terms of your utility function. But it's a little bit cumbersome. So economists have developed a way to kind of summarize this problem. And that's really the theory of demand. And that's where I want to go next. So if I start with this primitive, maximize u of x1 up to xn, subject to the sum of the xi pi less than or equal to m, I get my first order conditions that I just put on the board. Partial u, partial x1 equals lambda p1, down to partial u, partial xn equals lambda pn, and the sum of the xi pi is m. Those are my n plus 1 equations in n plus 1 unknowns. Okay, so the n plus 1 equations are the proportionality between prices and margin utilities and the budget constraint. The budget constraint is going to turn out to play a major role here, and I'll come back to that a little later. All right? Now we have n plus 1 equations and n plus 1 unknowns. In general, we'll be able to solve these things. So we can solve these for x1 star, the equilibrium amount of x1 I'm going to choose, which is the solution to this, is x1m of p1 up to pn and m. That is, if I tell you p1 up to pn and m, you can solve this equation for the optimal and lambda star equals lambda of p1 up to pn and m. Okay? So those are the results of solving those first order conditions, the way to think about it. This is what's called the demand equations. And these are a particular type of demand equations which are called the Marshallian demand equations. That is, they're after a famous economist, Alfred Marshall. And the key thing about the Marshallian equations is that they tell me the optimal level of x1 as a function of the prices of goods 1 up to good n and income. So you tell me the prices and income, and I'll tell you how much he consumes. It's a summary of this maximization problem, right? Everybody see where the demand equations come from? You have this Marshallian, you have this maximization problem. You say, okay, give me the prices and income. That gives me the budget constraint. I combine that with the utility function. That gives me the demand equation. Now, it's important to understand what's going on in these demand equations. So, for example, when I look at, like, from the Marshallian equations, partial x1 star, partial pj equals partial xm, partial pj, of p1 to pn and m. So this tells me, as I change the price of good J, what will happen to the equilibrium consumption of good 1? Well, that's measured by the partial derivative of this Marshallian demand equation. Now, what am I assuming about all the other goods in the Marshallian system? Am I holding the consumption of those other goods constant? No, the Marshallian system implicitly, or explicitly, depending on how you think about it, is saying, I'm looking at how will good 1 respond to the price of good J when this person can freely adjust all the goods in that utility function. Right? He's not just adjusting good J and good 1. He's adjusting his whole portfolio of goods. Right? The Marshallian equations correspond to a world in which this person can adjust all these goods in response to the price of good J. You're not just adjusting good I, you're not just adjusting good J, you're adjusting all the goods. The reason that can be very important, particularly when you want to look at data, is that might be important. You might want to ask, is that what's going on in the experiment I'm seeing? Are people really going to be able to make the adjustments implied by these Marshallian demand equations? Because sometimes they can't. Sometimes it takes time to adjust some of these goods. That's going to lead to, for example, some differences between short-run and long-run responses. Right? That is, the goods are going to adjust, and you want to think about how, well, it might take some time for people to respond to this price change. If I want to consume more of one thing, I got to consume less of others. And if those are kind of sticky, if there's costs of adjustment and things like that, that can affect the way in which people respond. The responses are going to be mediated by the ability of people to adjust. In general, the way we usually think about economics, people can make more adjustments the more time you give them. And we're going to talk about that as part of our analysis. That often in economics, you might say, well, geez, things didn't change much when prices change. Well, give them time. people will make more adjustments. They'll be able to change more things. And often it'll change things that seem very unrelated to what started the whole thing. All right, we'll talk about that again. These are the Marshallian responses. Now, there's some restrictions that utility maximization is going to place upon these Marshallian demand equations. Now, one of the ways we often summarize the Marshallian demand curves is not so much in terms of derivatives, but in terms of elasticities. Okay? And in particular, I'm going to talk about some various elasticities. So one of the things I'll often talk about is what you might call epsilon II. That is the elasticity of the consumption of good I with respect to the price of good I, which measures the percentage change in I divided by the percentage change in PI, okay, which is just equal to, in my example here, partial XI M partial PI times PI over XI. Okay, that's the way we're going to measure the elasticity, is we're going to look at the price derivative multiplied by PI over XI, which you can think of, those of you who like kind of differentials, as partial XI M over XI divided by partial PI, now PI over PI, which is the kind of ratio of percentage change. This is the change in XI divided by its quantity, so that's the percentage. Same I've done for price. Okay. This is the way we're going to measure elasticities. Often economists will just call this epsilon I. Right? People say, what's the elasticity of demand for gasoline? People say the elasticity of demand for gasoline is 0.12, or minus 0.12, they really should say. If they say 0.12, they usually mean minus 0.12. Okay, that's the other thing. People often, shorthand, will say positive even though they're really thinking of it as negative. But anyway, when somebody says the price elasticity, they mean the own price elasticity. Okay? There's also what we might call cross-price elasticity, which is epsilon ij equals pj partial xi m partial pj divided by xi. So when I write epsilon ij, I mean the elasticity of I with respect to the price of j. How much does a 1% increase in the price of j reduce or increase the consumption of good I? We often make distinctions epsilon ij greater than 0. What do we usually say in that case? When a rise in the price of good j increases the consumption of good I. We have a term for this? Substitutes. X, I, and j are substitutes. Epsilon ij less than 0, I and j are complements. And we'll talk a lot about substitutes and complements. That's the language that we use in economics. Whether we're, sometimes people do it in terms of Marshallian, sometimes they don't. But we'll come back to that later. Any questions that people have? There's one final set of elasticities you can talk about, which is epsilon I, or I'll call it eta I, which is the income elasticity of demand I, which is partial xi partial m times m over xi. And that measures how does the consumption of good I respond to a change in income. Economists make a number of distinctions here. A to I greater than 0. We say I is normal. A to I less than 0. I is what? We call it inferior. A to I less than 1. I is a necessity. A to I bigger than 1. I is a luxury. What is kind of the average value of A to I? What's the average value? Tell me in what sense it's an average. What should be like, what is kind of like the reference value for A to I? Is it 0? 1, right, exactly. Why is it 1?
Well, in the sense that your income increases, you're going to buy more of goods.
Okay, think about it as your income goes up 10%.
You buy 10% more.
You can't buy 9% more of everything. You'd have money left over. You can't buy 11% more of everything, you wouldn't have enough money. So kind of you have to have some at least 10 and some less than or equal to 10. It could all be 10. You could increase everything 10%, which would give you income elasticity of 1 for everything. You could increase some 5 and some 15 and have them average out to give you the 10%. Couldn't have them all be negative, whatever, right? So 1 is kind of, and you can prove for yourself that the sum from I equals 1 to n of the SI A to I, where this is the share of good I in expenditure. So this expenditure share of good I, this got to be equal to 1. You'll be able to prove that pretty straightforward. Go home and prove that. Any idea how you're going to prove that? Just come straight off the budget constraint. Start with the budget constraint, then you should be able to just pop that right out. If you can't, I'll do it next time, but you should try to do it yourself. On the budget constraint, it should tell you that's the case. And this says a weighted average of the income elasticities has to be 1, which is kind of what we just said. On average, they got to work out to be 1. Some can be bigger than 1, some can be less than 1, on average they're 1. All right. So let's talk about it. Because income, inferior goods are going to turn out to be a pain in the butt in some ways, interesting in other ways. They play some role in economics, probably get talked about more than we should. But anyway, we'll talk about inferior goods. What's an example of an inferior good? What's an example of a good that's inferior? What? Potato. Okay.
Walmart brand sweaters.
Walmart brand sweaters. Kraft mac and cheese. Obviously, I haven't been to my house. But anyway, that's okay. No, I mean, but think about it. Let's go through each of these. Okay? So we have 2 examples of food, which is potatoes and Kraft mac and cheese. Is food inferior? No. I mean, in general, people buy more food as income goes up, right? As their income rises, they buy more food. What do we mean by more food? How would you measure food? The guy's buying like mac and cheese, steak, potatoes, oranges, all the hamburgers, all kinds of stuff. Okay. So you would measure food consumption equals the sum of PI, XI, I element of food. So So all the things we're going to call food, we're going to add up their expenditures. And we're going to say D food, the change in food, is the sum of what? From I element of food of PI dxi. What's important, and you can see this formula bears a strong resemblance to the formula I put on the board before, because it was the sum of PI dxi over all goods. This is just over the food goods. And it says, well, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to measure this thing in calories. I'm not going to measure this thing in pounds. I'm not going to measure it in some units like that, taste. I'm going to measure it by weighting the different goods by the PI. Now, you can fight with me about the PIs. And there are issues you could raise that are legit. But the PI's got one nice thing going for it, which is what? Why is this a good measure of food? Yeah, but it's in more than in standard units. Pounds would be in standard units too.
Yeah, but it's, well, okay, water is in pounds.
Okay, why does it not make sense? Why does this standard unit make more sense than pounds as a standard unit? Yeah, because they reflect, this is implicitly assigning a weight to each of the goods. It says when I add these things up, I'm going to count each unit of good I at some rate, and good J at another rate. And the PIs have a strong virtue going for them. They're his value that this guy places on each of those goods. I value a pound of steak at 3 times the price of a pound of hamburger because it sells for 3 times as much. Which tells me this guy who's buying the steak and a hamburger must value a pound of steak 3 times as much as he values a pound of hamburger. Right? So the virtue of this kind of expenditure measure. Now remember, I'm holding the prices constant. I'm not looking at DPI. That I'm not looking at. I'm saying take the prices and measure the change in consumption at those prices. Value it. Because it tells me the trade-offs he's willing to make. That's the big virtue of this. Is it reflects not just market values, it reflects his values. And even if the total pounds went down, he was getting steak that was worth 3 times as much as the hamburger. Even if total pounds went down, if the value went up, he was getting more food as he sees it, in terms of the value he gets from that food. Okay? Any questions that people have? Now, the tricky part is that goods are often complicated. They don't just give you food. You'd actually understand very little about food consumption in a rich country if you thought about food simply in terms of like nutrition, right? If you thought about the world as, if a nutritionist looks at the food market, they're just like, oh my God, it doesn't look anything like it should. People aren't valuing these goods based on this, quote, nutritional value that I think they should be looking. It's kind of like our dentist, right? Who's out there going, oh my God, these people aren't behaving the way I want them to. They're out there eating all this crap that they shouldn't be eating. But they like that crap. And they like it partly because it gives them what they're looking for in food, but sometimes they're getting it because it's entertaining. Right? If you look at this, it's a fun place to eat. You were in the restaurant business and you said, oh man, I'm just going to hire a bunch of nutritionists to determine how to design my restaurant. You're going out of business tomorrow. Right? You're just not going to be around. Okay? Anyway, so this advantage is it represents value. But anyway, so the point is, food consumption is going to be a normal good. But within food consumption, some goods are going to be inferior. You can have inferior goods, but they're almost always a subset of a broader category that's normal. That's the way inferior goods come about. It's not that people want less food as they get richer. is that they get their food in a different way. They buy less of certain things. Maybe they buy less mac and cheese. Maybe they buy less potatoes. But they buy other kinds of food to take its place. So we had potatoes and mac and cheese. What was the other example we had? What did somebody say? Walmart. So people buy less clothes. Clothes an inferior good? Definitely not in my household. We spend more on clothes as income goes up. Right? My household, definitely not in that inferior clothes category. But they buy more of other kind of clothes. The other thing that's really important is when you talk about something being inferior, you really got to think about what income level you're talking about. Believe me, Walmart is counting on Walmart being a normal good in many parts of the world. That is, as income grows, Walmart sweaters will be in more demand. Maybe among middle-class Americans, they might be in less demand as middle-class Americans go up. But as many people in the country in the world get richer, Walmart's counting on the income effect going in their direction. Right? So things are not inferior at all income levels. In fact, it doesn't make any sense. They couldn't be inferior at all income levels. They got to go up before they can go down. You got to consume before you can decrease consumption. Right? So they're not going to be inferior from the lowest income level to the highest. So broad categories of goods, food, clothing, transportation, entertainment, those are going to be normal. Inferior goods are going to be goods that are going to be normal over some income range, but may become inferior at other income ranges. And if you define goods narrowly enough, they'll almost always have that kind of a pattern where they're normal for a while and they become inferior as people substitute to even higher and higher, typically higher quality goods as income goes up. Now you might ask, why do people substitute toward higher quality goods as income rises, as opposed to just buy more of the same stuff? Why? Yeah.
When is so much of the service is needed, for example,
What do you mean by needed?
or desired? If I desire a vacation, or if I'm not that rich, I might buy a trip on a public airline. If I'm very rich, I might want to fly my own instead.
But But is it really the limitations of my wants that's driving it? Or is it more like some constraints? Like, and this is I think a fallacy of the way we set up the problem. It's my fault. Okay? I'll take the point. I wrote down this utility function as if that was kind of the primitive. And that creates the illusion that somehow demand and the theory of demand is embedded in people's psychology and inside their mind. Actually, most of what we know about demand theory is outside the person. It's really in the production process by which we produce what we ultimately want. And I think what's behind the vacation example is really the limited amount of time that one has. One can't, if you had an infinite amount of time, you'd say, shit, I'll just take 17 vacations to Hawaii. It's really, no, I gotta do higher quality vacations. I really like eating all these hamburgers, but man, maybe, I got a limited stomach capacity. I can't eat 12 fat guys' hamburgers. So I got to find like some other hamburger that I like even better than fat guys. Okay, or 5 guys, I guess. So I got to find that because if I had unlimited stomach capacity, maybe I would just eat more and more 5 guys. There also might be problems with my health if I did all that, but that's another form of this. In other words, you don't want to think about consumption and utility as this black box that somehow we can't get a window into. Much of what we know about consumer theory and demand theory is precisely because we know about these elements of what you might call household production. We know People want entertainment. And people want to travel. And people want food. And people want, all these different basic things. But there are constraints in terms of on the consumption side. And to the extent you can get those constraints out of things you can't see and into things you can see and measure, the more powerful your theory is going to be. Because the biggest problem we're going to have with this utility, at least the way I wrote it, is we got no theory. It's just a black box. You might have some restrictions I can put on you, but they're damn weak. What's really going to help me is if I can actually put some content in there. I can think about things being complements and substitutes because of things I can measure, things I can see. Okay? And that's going to turn out to be a big part of utility theory. And we've kind of subsumed all that here. We just wrote down these preferences as if that was the starting point. It's really not. Preferences that we see are really the product of some more fundamental underlying desires that people have, combined with the technologies they have for fulfilling those desires and using the goods that they purchase in the market to fill those desires. That's a whole field of things called household production that Gary Becker was fundamental in developing, kind of tried to get at those ideas. That the goods we actually care about are actually produced goods that we produce using the things that we buy in the marketplace. And you might say, well, geez, that's just adding an extra layer of complication. I think that's exactly wrong. It's actually adding a layer of observability. Like we talked about complements and substitutes. A good example of complements are like cars and gasoline. Everybody agrees cars and gasoline are complements. What does that have to do with utility? Does the complementarity flow out of psychology? Does psychology tell me why cars and gasoline ought to be complements? And somehow when people have more cars, they just like to have more gasoline? No, if I was from Mars, I could tell you cars and gasoline are going to be complements. Why? Yeah, because of the way they want transportation and they get used together. Right? It has nothing to do with preferences in the classical sense. Right? It's not a theory. I don't need a theory of preferences to tell me why cars and gasoline are complements. Okay? People see that? All right. Why don't we? So that's, so we can talk about income elasticities. We talk about normal versus inferior. So in general, the rule is going to be broad categories of goods are normal. Narrowly defined goods will often have some kind of life cycle where they're normal at some income ranges, even if they're inferior at higher income ranges. You can come up with weird examples where they kind of go down and go back up again, but we won't bother ourselves with those examples. Okay. All right. Let's talk a little about complements and substitutes, because complements and substitutes can be complicated. Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. I should have talked about that. Good point. You caught me on a mistake. I left that out. Like you want to know, does food go up as a share of consumption or does it go down?
Yeah, and actually we should think of it as an inferior.
No, necessity. A necessity is going to be a good. Necessity means your income elasticity is less than 1. That means your consumption rises less than proportionately with income. So when your income goes up 10%, consumption only goes up 3%. So if your consumption is only going up 3% and income's going up 10%, what's going to happen to your share? The share of income spent on that good is going to go down. So when the income elasticity is less than 1, the good is a necessity. Consumption, the share of income spent on that good is going to fall as income rises. So food would be a normal good, but a normal necessity. That is, typically we think of food expenditure as rising less than proportionally with income. So food would be a normal good, but it would be a necessity. An inferior good, by definition, is a necessity because its share clearly has to be going down because the absolute amount is going down. But there are a lot of goods that are going to be normal and necessities. They go up with income, but go up less than proportion. Okay? Now, a luxury, on the other hand, is going to have its share rise as income rises. Because if income goes up 10%, the luxury is going up 12%. So its share of income is going to go up because consumption rose more in proportional terms than income. People see that? Now, of course, these are all done holding prices constant. Right? These are all partial derivatives holding prices constant. So we're increasing income holding prices constant. Yes?
I just have a question. You said the luxury, the expenditure of luxury will go up, but the average of the necessity for income elasticity will be one.
Yeah, so you have to have, if you have some luxuries, you got to have some necessities. You can't have everything be a luxury.
But if that share is growing and the luxury is, the elasticity is very large.
It has to come down at some point. It can't stay, it can't, unless everything's going to get really inferior, it can't keep going. And it won't usually. You might have an income rate. Remember, don't want to think of these income elasticities as constants. Income elasticities fundamentally are going to vary with the level of income. Right? That is, when I'm poor and starving, we're probably going to have a pretty high income elasticity. As I get richer, the first thing I want to do is live to tomorrow. And one of the key things to living tomorrow is eating enough to survive. So I might have a very high income elasticity with respect to food at low income levels. At higher income levels, I really, I'm probably killing myself by eating more. Right? I'm probably shortening my life by eating more. In fact, we see as people get richer, in some ways they eat less. On a calorie dimension, for example, they might eat less. They might decide, well, geez, living longer, to consume all these other goods I can afford is worth more. I'm not going to eat so much of the stuff that shortens my life. I mean, there's a whole things like that. So yeah, no, you do not want to think of income elasticities as constants, right? It's like I said before, it's not like Walmart sweaters are inferior for everybody. They're strongly normal goods for a lot of people that Walmart's counting on to grow their market as incomes in the world expand. Even if they're going to lose share in places where incomes are already high. That's fine. I mean, that's the way income elasticities work. They're not the same at all income levels. There's a thing called an angle curve. An angle curve with an E. An angle curve measures how a consumption of a good changes as we change our income. And an angle curve isn't necessarily always upward sloping or always downward sloping. Usually it has some shape. Elasticity is not always bigger than one or less than one. It can vary from normal to from necessities to luxuries and vice versa, and can vary between normal and inferior. Now, broad categories of goods typically are normal, even though they may be necessities. There's nothing that says because it's a broad category it has to have an income elasticity of 1. Even very broad categories can have income elasticities less than 1. Food would be a typically good example of that. Many income ranges, food has an income elasticity substantially less than 1. Any questions that people have? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, well, I don't think it, but is the choice between Walmart sweaters and Prada sweaters, do you think that fundamentally, like, the guys who buy Prada sweaters have different preferences than the guys who buy Walmart sweaters? Or do you think they're like in a very different position in terms of the alternative? Right? It's more about the income levels, probably has the biggest effect on that, right? I don't think the secret lies in thinking about the underlying preferences. I think the secret lies in terms of again, there's a lot of sort of constraints on people's consumption in terms of, well, how many sweaters can I wear at once? It's right, it's really hard, right? When it comes to land, you can have a pretty big income elasticity over a long, wide range of income, because I might like having a 50-acre estate, or a 100-acre estate, or a 1,000-acre estate. I might want to have a 40,000 square foot house, right? I might want to have a 20,000 square foot apartment in downtown New York. I mean, you can spend lots and lots of money on those margins, and right, so that elasticity could be pretty high over wide income ranges. I'm not going to have a closet with 400 Walmart sweaters in it. That's just, I can't wear them all at the same time, right? There's a fundamental difference there. Now you might say that has to do with preferences. On the other hand, you might say, well, geez, it has a lot to do with technology, and what I can do with that extra land. And it would be different depending on what else is going on in the world. So prices will also matter. What other goods are available matter, implicitly prices. Any other questions that? Yeah.
If you can't measure utility independently of price, you can't put an electrode in someone's head, why have it as a variable in your theory? I mean, because the equations become topology, it just becomes topologies then.
No, it doesn't. Because I think it's a framework for thinking about how they're making their choices. And I don't need that. I don't need the electrode in their head, because once I know that they're making their choices in a particular way, I can use the choices that they've made to tell me about their preferences. So I see this guy. Go ahead. I see this guy. He chooses this point. Now, I can't see that indifference. I can't. I just don't, just from this one choice. But I know enough about how he's making his choice to know that indifference curve slope at that point is equal to that budget line. And that's the power of the theory. The power of the theory is to say, I can translate what I can see, which is the budget line, to learn about something I can't see, which is this guy's preference. So then when I see something happen in the future, I can predict his behavior because I'm thinking about it as being driven by this underlying process. That's the key of it. It's like if you can't, it's like when guys were trying to figure out where's there a black hole or whatever, right? They look for things that they could see moving, and they could say, well, geez, I got this star and it's orbiting in this very strange way, but I can explain its orbit because if there were a black hole sitting right here, I would exactly see what I'm seeing in terms of how this star is moving, right? That's kind of the same idea we're doing here.
It's not an observable.
Well, no, but the predictions of this theory are going to turn out to be observable. That's the point.
It's going to be heuristic.
No, well, it's not a heuristic. So let's say, for example, I use my theory, and I see the sum of the xi pi, and then I find equals m, and then I find another point, xi hat pi, which is less than m. Okay? And I went to this guy and I said, hey, you want this point over that one? What does my theory tell? He would never take that point if he had that choice. The fact that he chose that point tells me this point is worse. Because this point is not only below his indifference curve, it's below his budget line. That's the nature of the predictive power of this. That I can take this outside this context. Once I saw him make that choice, I can learn that he prefers that point to all these other points. In fact, that's how I'm going to learn about his preference. Right? I'm going to see him make this choice. How do I learn about preference? I start with this point here. And that's his point. That's a point. And I say, hey, guy, you want this point? And he says, nope, I won't take it. Want this point? Nope, I won't take it. Want this point? Yep, I'll take it. And I just keep doing that. I put all the boxes around the ones he chooses, and I put X's around all the ones he doesn't choose. And ultimately, I am going to learn about his preferences. That is, my theory of his behavior is going to allow me to learn about his preferences from his choices. And then I can use those preferences to answer all kinds of other questions I might be interested in. About how much he'd benefit from various programs, how he'd respond to various changes in the marketplace, things like that. That's the key of the theory. Now, one thing that is important is that when I offer him these choices, they have to really be choices. Don't ask him about what he likes better than what. You don't get sensible answers when you ask people things like that. Right? If you say, well, geez, would you prefer to do your homework early or you prefer to wait till the last minute? Okay? Well, you say, oh yeah, I prefer to do it early. Every damn week you wait till the last minute. So it's like, that answer is worth nothing to me. I gotta, this has to be a real choice. These are real choices. You ask people how much you drink, and then you total amount, all the amount that people say they drink. What do you think you find? It adds up a hell of a lot less than the total amount of alcohol sold. Okay? Like half. You ask them how much you go to church. You go to church, they ain't there. Right? It's like there's a lot more people saying they're going to church than are actually in the church. Should you be surprised by that? Heck no. I don't want you to think I'm a drunk. Of course I'm going to tell you I drink less than I do. Unless I'm 12 years old, in which case, yeah, I drink it all the time. It's like, but it's not surprising that 12-year-olds are going to overstate how much they drink. And 40-year-olds are going to understate how much they drink. That's economics, right? Think about the costs and the benefits. Anyway, we'll stop here and we'll pick up the next time.